Good morning and a very warm welcome to our online audience for the launch of the Future of Work and Disability, a Remote Opportunity. My name is Christa Belfini. I'm the Director of Employers for Change at the Open Doors Initiative. I'm a white female with long blonde hair and blue eyes, and today I'm wearing a long black sleeve dress. We had planned to have Senator Emer Curry here this morning, but unfortunately, due to circumstances outside of her control, she's unable to make it and be here today. But we thank her sincerely for her support with this document and with remote work policies in Ireland. I want to especially welcome and thank Joan, doctoral researcher at Maynooth University, who wrote this research document and whose passion and knowledge were integral to the research. Later on today, we're going to hear a panel discussion about the findings of the research chaired by David Joyce, Equality and Development Policy Officer at the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. David will be speaking to some of the research participants: Alexis Goldfarb, Senior Consultant, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, Vice President at Northern Trust Corporation, and Julianne Duffy-Gillen, Young Adult Mentor with the Explore programme at Chime. Thank you all for being here today. Thanks also to our ISL interpreter, Orla McCabe from Bridge Interpreting, and to AI Media, who are kindly providing live captioning of this event. Please feel free to share details of today's event on social media. You can follow us, Employers for Change and the Open Doors Initiative on Twitter and LinkedIn. And a full copy of today's report is now available on both of our websites, the link for which has been shared in the chat function. We are here this morning to launch the Future of Work and Disability, a Remote Opportunity. Employers for Change and the Open Doors Initiative were delighted to partner with Positive2Work Skillnet Ireland on commissioning this research to examine the impact of remote working during COVID-19 on people with disabilities. The research would not have been possible without the employers and the employees who participated in it and gave us great insight into the barriers and opportunity which arose throughout the pandemic in the context of remote working. Indeed, living through a pandemic has given both employers and employees an opportunity to consider how and where we do our work. Pre-COVID-19, remote working was really a notional idea that was often feared by employers. However, it provides greater flexibility in how people do their job, something which can be of great benefit to people with disabilities. And it is clear from this research that providing an option to hybrid or remote work is more attractive for many disabled people and can really remove barriers such as transport and or allow for greater flexibility around working hours. However, it is important that disabled employees are involved in all of these conversations and conversations within companies about policies and remote working policies that will affect them. After all, diversity is inviting everybody into your organisation, but true inclusion is ensuring that a true sense of belonging exists by allowing people to contribute to your company's direction and policies. And providing remote work or hybrid work opportunities should not leave disabled employees isolated from the rest of the workforce. And it's important that it's presented as an option for the individual, as opposed to a solution or alternative to providing accommodations. It is important to understand that our work environment needs are not automatically met in our home environments. There is much learning still needed in the area of disability inclusion, especially with remote and hybrid working still being a relatively new practice. This research lays out a number of leverage points, which our next speaker will bring us through in detail. And so without further ado, I'm delighted to now hand over to the author of this research, Joan, doctoral researcher at Maynooth University.
Thank you very much, Christabelle. I'm delighted to be here this morning, and I very much hope that I do the contributions of everybody who participated in the research justice, and that this morning's launch and the report itself act as a really good springboard into further conversation and action around this issue. I am going to give you some kind of context for the research and of course, and explain to you what it is that we did and why. So many of us here this morning will be aware that the Irish rate of the Irish employment rates of people with disabled people in Ireland is the lowest in Europe. And there's been 3 major reports out around that this year alone that point to the fact that the policies that we have that are aimed at raising capacity of job seekers are ineffective, and we need to look at it in a different way. Eurofound, the European Agency for Living and Working Conditions, found this year that the comprehensive employment strategy is unable to address the complexity of the task facing us in terms of increasing the inclusion and diversity of disabled people in employment. And the ESRI and OECD have also found that there's a link between not working and poverty, but also that employment policies are underperforming. And the OECD in particular points to the need to engage employers. And of course, all of that is within the context of a world that is constantly changing and evolving. We live in a very unpredictable world, as we all know, not just with the technology this morning, but in terms of COVID and so on. So the opportunity that COVID presented was quite unprecedented, as Christabelle pointed out, to reimagine how we might work from home, to reimagine different ways of organizing our work lives, and in particular to look at more in-depthly remote working and the opportunity that that might give to be more inclusive of people with disabilities in the workplace. So we wanted to know, what can we learn from the experience to turn these figures around and collectively contribute to making the most out of this new emerging remote opportunity and create greater inclusion in the workplace. So our research focus sought to bring to life the experience of working from home from the perspective of employers and employees with disabilities in order to identify leverage points that we could act on collectively, and I suppose creatively as well. And that's one of the reasons for this launch, and to engage in further conversation about how we might do this. And we're doing it in recognition that this is a complex environment. Each organization is different. Each worker is different, and people have different disabilities and experience even similar conditions differently. So there's multiple and contradictory perspectives and stakeholder roles in these situations, and issues are interrelated. We don't just have one identity. And similarly, it's been difficult to separate the experience of living through a pandemic from our work lives, as we all know. So setting boundaries around the issue is both necessary, but we have to recognize that it's also slightly artificial. So in order to explore this area, we held 3 workshops, one with employers, one with employees, and a third one with employers and employees together. And I just want to share with you a slide that shows a diagram of the 3 main areas that we found were very significant. The first one was about connecting, the degree to which people felt connected in the workplace. And I think one of the greatest surprises of COVID was the degree to which connections became possible online. The reasonable accommodations is the second area that we're interested in here. The degree to which it was easier or harder to recruit people with disabilities during the pandemic, the amount of autonomy and flexibility people had during their working day. And of course, a big issue specifically for employees was around technology and assistive technology specifically, and the degree to which this was understood by employers. The third area of concern was the degree to which continuous learning in this more volatile and complex environment is necessary. And that's both personal learning and the kind of tacit learning that we need to do our jobs, organizational learning around recruitment practices and so on, as well as cross sectoral learning where, as employers said, we can avoid reinventing the wheel. So I'm going to go through each of these in turn and give the leverage points that we came up with for these, and then we can look at discussing this in the panel discussion. With regards to connecting, I think that everybody became more aware of each other. We have a greater appreciation of each other's lives in context, whether people had different caring responsibilities, You know, it wasn't just the animals that we share our lives with that we were meeting. We came face to face with being in each other's homes in new and unexpected ways. And that gave a greater sense of connection. And it also gave greater opportunity for wider inclusion and transparency. Inclusion because we could now make contact with colleagues we'd lost touch with or attend events remotely that would have been unfeasible to travel to. And there was greater transparency in terms of the degree to which people were included in online platforms, because there was less talking over each other, and everybody, you know, developed an etiquette about engaging online. And what all of this did, of course, was reaffirm the importance of work in our lives, and particularly for those who weren't able to work remotely during the pandemic, when we were in lockdown. This was very, very strongly felt. The lack of purpose and meaning that they experienced whilst not working was also very much to the fore, as well as the mental health and fatigue concerns of everyone. Whilst employers did put a lot of measures in place to support Zoom fatigue, well-being, and so on, there were questions about the degree to which the take-up of these meant that they were working at this particular time. There were also concerns, of course, around visibility of disability in the workplace. And this is an ongoing issue which was exacerbated somehow by the pandemic, because people weren't seeing each other in situ. And it was difficult to see how people working from home were getting on, particularly if they were struggling with workloads, mental health, or managing disability. There was a sense by some that a disclosure of disability during the pandemic was made even more difficult, with the exception perhaps of mental health issues. So just some quotes here that illustrate some of the things that people said during the workshops. An employee said, employers need to give a little bit more encouragement and show that they see breaks as important, instead of holding a wellness session where employees are just told what to do. And this points to a sense of a need for direct communication with the employer themselves, and clear delineation around the flexibility allowed and the expectations allowed. There was a sense in which staff found that they were being given mixed messages. An employer perspective said that a year into the pandemic, that business as usual has become a top priority. So there's less resource available for the diversity and inclusion networks over the last year. And I think a little bit of this is the lack of visibility of being in the office too, where you have posters in the lift and around the canteen about events that are coming up, and you can walk around and talk to people. So the visual element is lacking, and we're really struggling to recruit committee members for the disability networks to progress our agenda. So certainly this was something that a lot of employers were saying, that it was more difficult to recruit members of D&I networks, and particularly to give attention to disability. There was a sense in which was not faring well because of other concerns around gender and race equality issues, which of course are important too. But that the inclusion agenda was being lost in that regard. So the leverage points that we identified for change was to firstly create an open space for new types of conversations that can sustain connections amongst all staff, and with a specific focus on including disabled people, disabled workers. And the second leverage point was to enhance the visibility of disabled people by creating placement supports and work sampling options that enhance greater connection and learning, and to do that as well across teams and functions. Okay, so the second issue then that we're looking at is reasonable accommodation. And here the employer concerns and employee concerns diverged a little bit. Employers were concerned about recruitment, about the fact that they did not feel disability confident enough to bring disabled workers on board and to be able to stay with them and accommodate their needs. They sought an A to Z of recruitment practices and pointed to gaps in state supports. For example, state supports were not perceived as great at targeting SMEs for including more people with disabilities and recruiting disabled people into the workforce. Employee concerns around accommodations, of course, were different. They looked for greater autonomy and control over their working day. People spoke a lot about being able to manage conditions better at home, being able to get up, walk around the room and then get back into a wheelchair, whereas in the workplace they were stuck in a wheelchair all day, which exacerbated pain and chronic fatigue, for example. Being able to control the lighting in a work area at home also helps some people with vision impairment. And then a large concern was around assistive technology. This was both accessing it, particularly at the start of the pandemic, and also misunderstandings about employers' conception of what was needed at home. There was often an assumption that people would have what they needed to work in their homes. And the difference between assistive technology, a technology, and how it might interact with the IT systems and work were also issues. So there was a lot of concerns around accessing the technology that people needed. And these were two of the major employee concerns. Technology wasn't so much a big issue for employers. An employee said, remote working should be a reasonable accommodation for people with disabilities. Some people may not be in a position to physically go somewhere or commit to be somewhere because of their disability, for example, chronic fatigue or being reliant on public transport. And an employer said, if someone came to me through the recruitment process and they had a disability, I would not have known that there were toolkits and a process in place for me to be able to assist them starting at the interview process. I would probably have went, oh God, that's going to be really difficult. If we could educate managers on the ground, they would be educating their teams and a lot more would be aware. And I think this speaks to the lack of disability confidence that employers were saying was very real for them, even though they really wanted to engage and employ more disabled workers. The leverage points that we came up with here were to develop reasonable accommodation policies that enhance autonomy of staff to manage their own workload along clear guidance of expectations so that they weren't getting mixed messages. Develop processes for inclusive recruitment processes, including crafting job descriptions that can be adapted to remote working. And finally, developing policies and trainings to support better understandings of and access to technology across the organization and across different functions in the organization. The third area, and this is the final one, was around collective learning. And I think the accommodating and connecting really all point to the need for continuous learning in organizations that isn't necessarily all about formal training. At an individual level, it was around creating an environment for tacit learning, informal learning. And that was between the disabled employee, manager, and team. So negotiating reasonable accommodations was seen as important. And being able to negotiate and speak up for what it was that people needed. Being able to manage workloads was really important. And also sustaining connection and inclusion within a team, that informal connection and relationship that meant that people were able to work across boundaries a lot more easily. Organizational learning was around creating reasonable accommodation policies, raising capacity across disciplines to recruit and retain disabled staff. And then there was this also very strongly recognized need for cross-organizational learning that would cut across organizations and help inform individual organizations around what was available without everybody having to go off and reinvent wheels and try to figure it out alone. And I think this is perhaps where organizations such as Employers for Change have got a big role as well. So just some quotes from individual learners, employees saying, I can't pop into a colleague's office on top of that for a quick chat about something. It's now either email tennis or an instant message tennis or a quick phone call. And I don't want to assume that they're not busy. In terms of organizational learning, an employer said, tone and strategy does come from the top. We're massively engaged in the D&I agenda. It's just that there's no engagement around disability. And in terms of cross-learning, an employer said, one thing that could be powerful in enlarging the collective of everyone on this call, that was the workshop that we had, and resources that are available from government level perspective. So levering the power of the collective was really important. We saw that in terms of leverage points, that developing system convener roles within organizations to support learning across organizational disciplinary boundaries might be really, really useful. And that's giving somebody the legitimacy to cut horizontally through an organization and help smooth things out so that people could get what they needed. Convening an employers forum to enhance a cross-system learning forum amongst employers, and the wider system of supports was also seen as important. And our final leverage point was to develop a campaign to raise the visibility of disabled people in the workplace and enhance organizational learning. So that they are all my slides. Christabelle has already shared the link to the report, and I'm going to hand back now to Christabelle.
Thanks very much, Joan, and thanks for bringing us through the key points there of the research. And I think that the quotes really from the research participants are particularly interesting and insightful to hear as well. Now, I'm really delighted to introduce David Joyce, Equality and Development Policy Officer at the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, who's going to be speaking to Alexis Goldfarb, Senior Consultant, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion, Vice President at Northern Trust Corporation, and Julianne Duffy-Gillen, Young Adult Mentor at the Explore Programme with Chime. So over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Christabelle. Just to introduce myself, I'm David Joyce. I'm Equality Officer with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. I'm, I suppose, a man of a certain age betrayed by my glasses in order to see you all and read anything today, and also the greyness of my beard. So I'm delighted to be here this morning and to have this opportunity to share what I hope will be a very interesting and informative discussion around the research that Joan has outlined to us just a few minutes ago. Can I just congratulate Joan, obviously, and also Open Doors and Employers for Change and Positive2Work Skillnet for the initiative. It's a very timely one in that we have recently seen with the, and I think Joan mentioned it, the recent ESRI and OECD reports show how much work we have to do in terms of improving our performance on the employment of disabled people, and also through having, and still going through the pandemic and the experience we've all had in terms of remote working and more flexible working arrangements, and two government departments indeed considering these issues in terms of a right to remote working and a right to request flexible working as part of the transposition of the EU work-life balance directive. So it's really timely in that regard. So it's great to meet Alexis and Julianne, and I suppose I'll start with a very general question in terms of what are your reactions to what we've heard so far? Any comments on what strikes you most in what you've heard from Joan and the research this morning? Purely alphabetically, Alexis, I'll go to you first.
Thanks everyone, and great to be here. Just by way of very brief introduction, my name is Alexis Goldfarb. I'm Senior Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Consultant for Northern Trust EMEA, and I'm a white female with dark, long brown hair wearing a green jumper today. Thanks for the question. I was fascinated by the research, and it was great to hear Joan's overview just now. And what really struck me was a really important reminder that came over me, which was that working from home is not an automatic solution for inclusion. I think very early on into the pandemic, a lot of people focused on the positives that working remotely and working from home gave. And I think very soon after, the novelty actually wore off. And I think what really struck me just this morning in listening to Joan was how much more we have to do in understanding about remote working, and then what that is going to look like when we get into hybrid working. I'm coming from a place, I'm still working at home, so I haven't even entered the world of hybrid working yet. And I think we are still learning so much about remote working. Those learnings will come when we get into hybrid working. And then what we need to do is really understand what that means for diverse communities. So actually, as the needs and the expectations change and evolve and shift as we become familiar, what does that mean for diverse and disabled communities? And what can employers do to support those needs and to ensure that our people can thrive? And I just think I was struck by how much more we have to do to learn and how much more we have to do to educate ourselves.
Absolutely, yeah, and obviously the research is a very useful resource for all of us, kind of charting our course in this way. Julianne, would you like to make a few opening remarks at this stage?
Thank you, David. My name is Julianne Duffy-Gillen, and I work with Chime, the Explore program, which is a young adult mentoring program. And I'm working a lot with 16 to 25-year-olds at the transitioning to further education, employment, and training. And I'm a woman in my prime, as I like to say, rather than say of a certain age. I have white grey hair and a purple fringe. I think make me look cool with the young group that I mixed with. And I wear glasses, and today I'm wearing a multicolored, almost like a mock leopard print top with a black cardigan. I've been listening to all along. It's been very interesting, and I've been involved in various workshops as well. And I think for what we've learned from remote working and now hybrid working is that there's been a steep learning curve for every employee, but more so when you have a disability on top of that, because a lot of technology has been a hit and miss for most of us. For myself, I was put into the deep end where we were told we're going to be using Teams, we're not going to be using Zoom, we're going to be doing this, we're going to be doing that. And sometimes finding out what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, and informing our employer of these limitations that we have on technology haven't been easy for a lot of people. So I was really delighted to have this launch and this research published by Joan. I think it's a valuable piece of work, and I'm looking forward to using it when we're working with employers to make them aware of what work and what is needed to be done. Personally, I think we have a lot to do ourselves as advocates to promote awareness of this issue and to make employers more and more aware of what is needed, of what works well. And on a positive note, to show that hybrid and remote working, there's actually a lot of research there showing an increase in work productivity from the employee side. So it shouldn't be something that's just dismissed, but the employer could be seen to be more proactive in engaging more with the employers with disabilities in order to make the workplace and the home work much more accessible and much more interactive and more engaging with other employees. So it's not like they're an afterthought or they're something to be worked on later on, but as a valuable, productive member of the workforce. So I'm really looking forward to this panel today to discuss these findings and how we can see it working well going forward.
Great, thanks, Julianne. And your fringe, the colour of your fringe matches the corporate background for today, so it's very appropriate.
I aim to please.
So look, let's get into some of the detail that Joan outlined for us in terms of the three sections of the report: the connecting, accommodating, and learning. And maybe if we can start with the connecting piece. And obviously that's been a mixed experience for everyone. I mean, some obviously felt more connected, and I was struck by somebody's description of online meetings and kind of etiquette that is attached to them, and how we all tend to just obey it without even thinking. So we don't tend to interrupt people. We don't tend to do things perhaps that we might do in person. And for some people that has been a very positive experience. For some, obviously, it has led to feelings of isolation and mental health issues, obviously, as well. So can I just ask, what employer practices do you think can alleviate isolation often experienced by disabled people in this context? Alexis, I'll go to you.
I wish I had like a magic solution, because I think, as you already alluded to, David, so many people have experienced isolation over the best part of 18 to 20 months now. I think organisations just have to be more strategic and more tailored in encouraging connection and engagement, and actually being quite specific to organise check-ins. And I don't just mean check-ins to focus on kind of, where are you on your work? What's the status of that project? But actually allocating perhaps 15, 20 minutes just for an emotional check-in. I think employers can also use employee resource groups to staff affinity networks effectively. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I had some really innovative ways in which organisations were using their staff network groups. And one really nice idea that I remember hearing was the notion of an open Zoom line. So kind of bringing the notion of an open door virtual. So just an open Zoom line where people could kind of pop in and out as they so wish, depending on their diaries, for the best part of an hour, and just almost creating a virtual replacement of those water cooler moments, which I think we've all missed so much. But I think there's no easy way. I think employers just have to be quite tailored and quite targeted in encouraging those really brief check-ins, which are focused on kind of emotional and mental health and well-being, as opposed to business as usual and project updates and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, who would have thought we'd be missing the water cooler moment so much? But there you go. I think it has transpired. Julianne, what would you say to that question?
I agree. There's been I think at the start of the pandemic, we all thought this was going to be a temporary measure. So there wasn't much focus on keeping in and linking in. It was more about getting the work done and engaging with our clients. And there was more focus on the work aspect rather than the social aspect of things. And the longer the lockdown and the remote working went on, it became very noticeable that mental health and the isolation was an issue. And employers started to put in places like offering solutions, as in workshops with a well-being expert. And some of these didn't relate well to the employees, because they didn't feel it wasn't going enough to, we listen in, but we still have to do the work ourselves. So it would have been better if the employers maybe had engaged in with the company. I have a best practice example out there from one of the banks. One of the banks was using a daily LinkedIn meeting. And it wasn't a formal meeting per se with the employees. It was like each section had their own daily LinkedIn. It was more basically for a chat, and to see how people were getting on, how they were feeling, and had they something funny to share. It was just an opportunity for them to talk to somebody, even for 20, 30 minutes during the day. And I thought that was a great example of how employers could help to lessen the social anxiety and to keep that social aspect going, the water cooler chat going, by having a mandatory link in each day. And that kind of keep them linked. And some of the employees were looking forward to this link-in. Now, I am aware of this because there was a couple of deaf people who were employed by the bank, but they felt a little bit left out because this was a daily thing. We couldn't afford to provide an ISL interpreter every day for this watercooler. So that added another barrier for people with a hearing loss. And later on, you notice that the online like Zoom and Team started to add in closed captioning options, which means you can click and they will automatically transcribe speech to text, which was great, but it's not accurate because the live transcription only gives about 70% accuracy. So they're only getting the gist of what was said. So there was still an initial barrier there. Then we're moving now into a hybrid working model, which means we're working from home, we're working from the office part-time. And that seems to be working a lot better because people are going in for the social element and catching up with what needs to be done and getting the team meetings done, everything, and then going home and doing the bulk of the work at home without any interruption. So there seems to be a great support and, you know, a much more embracing of the hybrid model, both by employees and by the employers. So I think something like that might work going forward, is to make sure that the access is fully, inclusion is, aspects are kept on top of what is needed by the employee, but they still feel like they're a valuable member of the team.
Fantastic, yeah. I think the importance of again, I think what Alexis said at the beginning and is in the research, that being remote is not an automatic solution to the issues faced by disabled people in the workplace. And while it can provide some solutions, you know, they have to be carefully talked through, and they need to be discussed with disabled workers and their representatives as well. And I think that's really important. And I suppose moving on to that, you know, how can the visibility of disabled people be enhanced with, you know, so many of us working remotely at this time? I'll change the order, and maybe just to keep it keep us all awake. Julianne, do you want to take that?
Well, I think there should be more awareness, disability awareness, provided to employers to keep them on their toes. Like most employers tend to go for disability awareness when they're starting out with a new employee, and then after a few years, it's just the lack of understanding just kind of slightly drops. They just become accustomed to what works and what doesn't work, and they just go with that. They're not looking at the next generation, the new technology. Is to have ongoing requirement to keep fresh. I mean, we all have to do like manual handling, GDPR, children first policy, all those. We have to do them every 2 years to keep them fresh in our mind. We need to have a similar kind of expectation for disability awareness training to be given to all employees and employers to keep them aware of what is needed for the workforce, and to include the inclusion process is kept on top of things, because it's an easily start going backwards, and then they become forgotten very easily.
That's an excellent suggestion, Julianne. Yeah, brilliant. Alexis?
Totally agree. The only thing that I would add is that we need to maintain an ambition to create a culture where disabled employees feel able to disclose their disability status, because I think there's a real gap that I see, especially at that line manager level. Organizations, you know, the top of the house can do a lot in terms of raising awareness, encouraging education, raising awareness, absolutely. But ultimately, if our employees aren't able to disclose their disability status and feel safe and encouraged to have those conversations honestly and authentically about their personal circumstances, about their needs, their expectations, we're going to be unable to create the change that we need to make to support that individual in the long run. So I think the two go hand in hand, if you will. Okay,
great. Well, let's move on to the accommodating section, and there's kind of three main areas for development identified here. That's reasonable accommodation, obviously, more inclusive recruitment processes, and better policies around assistive technology. technology. So which would be a priority for you and why? And we'll stick with you, Alexis, since you're on screen here.
Can I have two? I'm going to say two, and I'll be quick, whether you give me two or not. I think they're all, of equal importance, absolutely. I think I've already alluded to the responsibility that I think employers have in supporting their existing staff, their existing talent. We need to kind of engage our disabled employees to understand their needs, their expectation, and we therefore need to be able to design policies to support them accordingly. I also think inclusive recruitment is absolutely critical when we think about the future of the workplace, the future of your own workforce. Your recruitment teams are the first point of contact with any external candidate. You need to ensure that you're presenting not only as an employer of choice to be disability confident when working with external parties, but you also want all external parties to be able to thrive and position themselves in their best position when they're going through the recruitment process, which I appreciate can be a tricky experience for many. So I think they're all of equal importance, but those are the kind of two which I would really hone in on.
Okay, and can I ask you, Alexis, before I move back to Julianne, in your view, do you think the right to remote work should be considered a reasonable accommodation in itself?
Yes.
I think there's a general, sorry, I thought it was me, no one. I think a lot of employers seem to think that once an employee is working from home, the home is already accessible to them. So there's a less onus on the employer to ensure that the home is accessible. One of the general things was a lot of people said that it was expected of the employee to have their own desk and share. So maybe what if the person with disability needed a special share? Or they're in a wheelchair, as soon as you, I'm sure you're in a wheelchair, you don't need a share. There's just a lot of assumptions going on, but I think from the point of view, it works both ways. So as an employee myself, I would have the to find a way to advocate for myself more and to be able to lobby my employer and say, no, I need this, I need X, Y, and Z. Now, a lot of people wouldn't have the courage or the ability to do that. So there's a need for more advocates and more support services to be in place to be able to advocate on behalf of the employee to the employer to make them aware that there is an onus on them to provide access to accommodation and not to assume that the home is completely accessible. There's also a fear of technology and the cost of technology needed. And we are living in a very technical age where everything is changing all the time, and technology is not as expensive as initially is. And a lot of it is just an additional software package on a standard laptop, or it could be just, an additional piece of equipment that could assist the employee in working better. So they should be looking at this as a valuable investment to ensure that the productivity of the employee is kept on par and maybe above expectation, as that often happens, as some people with a disability are assumed to be working below their peers, but a majority of them are actually working exceeding the expectations of their peers already. So I think we need to kind of allow that to be rewarded by ensuring that the best workplace, regardless whether they're home or in the office, is made accessible and made available to the employee. Because an investment in the company's long-term future, cost should not come into it. So I'm not a fan of reasonable accommodation as such. I think the best support is put in place and you get a fully rewarding employee and a productive workforce. What more can you argue for?
Okay, great. Yeah, I think you make important points there around the fact that somebody is working from home perhaps doesn't automatically lead to positive results, and that person is still entitled to all the rights that they have on site in an employer's office or whatever kind of setting it is, including, of course, reasonable accommodation. And I mention it again just because I think there may be an opportunity to insert this into a discussion around the review of our Equality Acts here in Ireland at the moment. The Department of Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, to give it its full title, is seeking submissions from people around how they think our equality laws could be revised. So obviously that would include access to reasonable accommodation as well. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move us on to the learning section, and the systems convener role, which I must say was a new one on me. Alexis, can I ask you, is that a viable option in your organization to learn from each other, do you think?
Absolutely. I'm a huge advocate for collaboration, for connection. At Northern Trust, we work, collaboratively with lots of other organisations. I think there's a real opportunity to share best practice and to learn from one another. I think about the conversation surrounding diversity and inclusion more broadly. We've come a long way in terms of our understanding, and if we're actually committed to creating real change across organisations and across kind of broader society, I think it's up to each and every one of us to connect with one another, to share best practice, to share learnings, to understand what hasn't worked well and what has worked well, and to really engage confidently in slightly more tricky conversations that we might perhaps have not once enjoyed talking to other individuals or organisations about, but actually there's a real opportunity to kind of break down some of those barriers and engage in some of these more difficult conversations. And
would you see a role for employers for change in developing this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I've already alluded to the kind of partnerships that we work with closely at Northern Trust via ODI and Employers for Change already. I think there's a real opportunity for Employers for Change to kind of act as that conduit to kind of navigate some of the conversations and really provide that central point of advocacy cross organisationally.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Alexis, to asking you to pick out one recommendation that you'd really like to see action on immediately. But Julianne, do you want to add anything on the systems convener role?
Yeah, I've seen in the last 20 months, we've seen a growth in online training. A lot of it has been very much short and sweet and is going straight to the point. Especially in my organisation, our employers have encouraged us to get involved with Lincoln Learning. So we're expected to do 1 hour of Lincoln Learning access a week. And it means that we can have access to 100,000 of online training courses, different topics under the sun. And it's something to keep us going and fresh. We never had this onus on us before. There's HEC land, there's loads of online training being given. And what it is, it's a great resource. It saves so much time and so much energy. And employers are much more engaging with training. So I think that is something going forward that should be encouraged. Now, I know that Employers for Change has been very proactive in designing online accessible courses as well for people with disabilities in connecting with the employer, and also with mentorship, which is something that can be done in an hour's meeting on a daily basis. There is so much potential for us, for people. You don't have to leave your house, you don't have to leave your office to get additional training. And I think that we should be embracing these new technologies and making them a better service for employees going forward.
Brilliant. So Julianne, finally for you, what recommendation would you like to see most action on quickly? What's the most important? I would like to see much more training on disability awareness. I don't see a lot of disability awareness on Lincoln Learning, but just to give you that, going back by my own example. And I would like to see a little bit more emphasis on providing different types of training according to different types of disability. So if you have someone who is hard of hearing, or someone who is deaf and a sign language user, or someone who is has a mobility limitations, or has who are blind or partially sighted, you have different types of training according to what the person needs or what can be improved for access for that person.
I'd like to see much more of a focus on education and awareness training going forward, because I think that is the way forward, is to make people aware of what could be done and what the solutions are. And it makes it less scary and much more inclusive and much more open, and provides loads of ideas that can just make a worker's life much more smoother. So somebody with a disability is just as productive as their able-bodied peer. It's just a matter of putting the right supports in place.
Brilliant. Thank you, Julianne, and thanks for all your contributions this morning. Alexis, I'll give you a few seconds there on one recommendation.
The learning. I think the notion of an employer forum and the convener roles, I think, will hold organisations to account and will really enable that continuous learning that is so required. I think the needs and the demands and the expectations of diverse communities is constantly evolving, and employers need to hold themselves to account and to maintain their learning to ensure that they're able to serve their employees in the best possible way.
Brilliant. Look, can I just, on behalf of everyone on the call, thank you, Alexis and Julianne, for your really insightful contributions this morning. Thank you so much for participating in the discussion. And I'll hand back to Christabelle.
So that's all that we have time for today. Thank you so much, as David Joyce said there, to our speakers, to David Joyce, to Joan O'Donnell for all of their work. Also, you know, the discussion there this afternoon has been so insightful, and to actually hear that lived experience from Julianne and hearing from Alexis Goldfarb of Northern Trust as well really gives us insight into where this research has come from and some of the voices who were actually involved in it as well. I want to pay a special thanks to Positive2Work, who have sponsored the research paper. Without whom it wouldn't have been possible. To my colleagues in the Open Doors Initiative, and again to all of the employers and all of the employees who participated in the workshops for this research paper and were so giving of their time. Employers for Change and the Open Doors Initiative will take the learnings from this research paper, and we will engage with employers to ensure that we're addressing the needs of both employers and employees with disabilities. And we hope that more employers will engage in our service to bring disability to the fore of the diversity and inclusion agenda within their own organisations and indeed in society as a whole. Thank you all for joining us today. Slán.